The sky over Charleston was heavy with rain the day I came home. I was still weak, my hospital wristband clinging to my skin, my small overnight bag dragging behind me. 3 weeks in recovery after open-heart surgery had made me fragile but hopeful. I thought my son would be waiting at the door, smiling the way he used to when he was 10. Instead, Lydia, my daughter-in-law, stood on the porch with folded arms and a polished grin. "You can't stay here anymore, Evelyn," she said. "This is our house now." Behind her, Michael stood, silent eyes fixed on the floor, his wedding band glinting like betrayal. The sound of my keys in my pocket suddenly felt heavier than my heart. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My only child wouldn't even look at me. I wanted to ask why. Instead, I turned around, stepped off the porch, and walked back into the rain, the cold stinging my stitches more than any scalpel ever could. By the time I reached the curb, my taxi driver was still waiting, windshield wipers slapping rhythmically against the downpour. He leaned over and opened the door. "Everything all right, ma'am?" His voice was cautious, polite. I swallowed hard, forcing myself not to cry. "Just take me somewhere with a bed," I said, clutching the small envelope that held my hospital discharge papers. We drove through the soaked streets of Charleston in silence. The city looked almost foreign after 3 weeks in the sterile light of the hospital brick houses, gleaming wet moss hanging heavy from the oaks and the scent of salt water drifting in through the cracked window. I pressed my palm against my chest, feeling the steady but fragile rhythm of my heart. I should have felt grateful to be alive. Instead, I felt homeless. The driver dropped me off at a small roadside motel near the outskirts of town. The neon sign flickered between Vac and Ansi. Inside, the air smelled faintly of bleach and cigarette smoke. I paid for 2 nights in cash, the clerk barely glancing up as he handed me a key. The room was small, 1 bed, 1 desk, 1 tired lamp. When the door closed behind me, the sound of rain faded, leaving only the hum of the air conditioner. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in the same clothes I had worn home from the hospital. My suitcase was damp, my hair frizzy from the humidity. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the house keys, silver, familiar, now useless. They left small, wet circles on the bedspread where my hand trembled. 35 years of memories reduced to metal I could no longer use. The pain in my chest wasn't physical, it was the sound of my own son's silence. When Robert, my husband, died 8 years ago, Michael promised he'd always look after me. "You'll never be alone, Mom," he'd said at the graveside, holding my hand as if he meant it. I had believed him. I raised him to believe that family was everything. I didn't realize that promise had an expiration date. I changed into the clean nightgown the nurse had folded in my hospital bag and sat by the small window. The parking lot glistened with reflections of red tail lights. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like an afterthought. I pulled the discharge papers from the envelope and laid them flat on the table. The words "released in stable condition" looked mocking. Stable, my entire life had collapsed in less than 10 minutes. I tried to replay what happened at the door, hoping there had been some misunderstanding. Lydia's voice was still in my head, smooth, rehearsed, almost gleeful. "This is our house now. Our house." She had always called it that, even when it wasn't. I remembered the day Michael introduced her, how she'd walked through my kitchen like she already owned it. Robert had whispered to me that night, "Watch that one, Evie. She's got ambition sharp enough to cut glass." I'd laughed then. I wasn't laughing now. My phone buzzed once on the nightstand. A message from an unknown number. "Hope you find a place soon." No name, but I knew it was Lydia. The gall to send that while my hospital wristband was still on. I blocked the number without replying. My hands shook as I set the phone down. Hours passed before I realized I hadn't eaten. I found a vending machine down the hall and bought a small bag of crackers. The sound of coins dropping reminded me of my old office back when I worked as a senior accountant for the city. Numbers had always been my comfort, predictable, balanced fare. People weren't. I returned to the room, sat down again, and opened my wallet. A photograph of Robert fell out, a younger version of him holding Michael as a toddler in front of the same house I'd been thrown out of today. They were both smiling, sunlight pouring through the oak trees. I traced their faces with my thumb. "If you were here, Robert," I whispered, "you'd know what to do." But he wasn't here. It was just me, a motel room, and a pair of useless keys. When I finally lay down, I couldn't sleep. My mind ran in circles, flipping through every conversation of the past few months. Lydia had been unusually kind before my surgery, bringing flowers, offering to help with paperwork. I had trusted her. God help me. I'd signed whatever she placed in front of me, too tired to read it all. Power of attorney, she'd said, so Michael could make decisions if something went wrong. I never imagined it would be used against me. The air conditioner clicked off. In the sudden quiet, I heard the rain again, softer now. Somewhere, a TV murmured through the wall. I stared at the ceiling until my eyes burned. They took everything I whispered. Everything. Then a memory surfaced, Robert's voice, calm and steady. If you ever feel lost, call Rosa. Rosa Mitchell. My college roommate, my dearest friend, and one of the smartest women I'd ever known. She'd gone into law, financial law to be exact, and had helped me with Robert's estate years ago. I hadn't spoken to her since before the surgery, too embarrassed to admit how frail I'd become. I reached for my purse and found her old business card, edges bent from age. The ink was slightly faded, Rosa L. Mitchell, Esquire. Her personal number was scrawled in blue pen at the bottom. I hesitated, thumb hovering over my phone's keypad. It was past midnight, but what did time matter now? The phone rang twice before I heard her voice, groggy but unmistakable. Evelyn, are you okay? My throat tightened. Rosa, I think my son just stole my house. A pause. Then her tone shifted, no longer sleepy but sharp and alert. Start from the beginning, she said. I told her everything, the hospital, the porch, Lydia's words, Michael's silence. Rosa didn't interrupt, not once. When I finished, there was a long silence on her end. Finally, she said, Evelyn, this sounds like power of attorney abuse. Don't panic. We can fix it. Do you still have the papers you signed before surgery? Yes. They're in my hospital bag. Good. Don't touch anything until I get there. I'll be in Charleston by morning. Her certainty was a lifeline I hadn't realized I needed. After the call ended, I sat for a long time staring at the glow of the motel sign outside. The word vacancy blinked red against the wet pavement as if mocking me. Yet for the first time since leaving the hospital, I felt something other than despair, something closer to resolve. I picked up my keys from the table and closed my fingers around them. The metal was cold but solid, familiar. They weren't useless after all. They were proof of what was taken and what I intended to take back. Tomorrow, I told myself, I'd start fighting. Tonight I'd survive the rain. I placed the keys beside my bed and turned off the lamp. Outside, the storm was ending, but the thunder in my chest was just beginning. The knock came at exactly 7:30 in the morning. I hadn't slept, only drifted in and out between the sound of rain tapering off and trucks on the highway. When I opened the door, Rosa was standing there, her gray trench coat damp from travel, a leather briefcase clutched in one hand, and that familiar razor-sharp look in her eyes. You look terrible, she said softly, stepping inside. Which is good. Judges believe people who look exhausted. I tried to laugh, but my throat ached. I didn't expect you to come so quickly. I caught the red eye from Atlanta, and when a friend calls me saying her son stole her house, I move. She took in the room, the half-open suitcase, the untouched crackers on the desk, the keys beside the lamp. All right, Evelyn, show me what you signed. I handed her the manila envelope that had been sitting beside my hospital bag. She opened it on the table, slipping on her reading glasses. The morning light through the motel blinds striped her face. Power of attorney, she murmured, flipping through the pages. Medical decisions, yes, but here, she tapped a section with her pen. Financial authorization. They buried it in paragraph 12C. You technically gave Michael the right to manage all your assets while you were incapacitated. Incapacitated. I repeated the word, bitter on my tongue. I was recovering, not brain dead. Rosa sighed. They count on that confusion. People sign without reading, especially when they're scared. I've seen this trick before, usually from strangers, not family. I sat on the bed holding my chest. So legally, he could take the house, not if we can prove intent or fraud. If he used your signature beyond medical authority, we can challenge it. But first, we need documentation, bank statements, title transfers, any record of property exchange. Do you still have access to your accounts? I nodded slowly. I haven't checked since the surgery. I didn't think I'd need to. Rosa handed me her phone. Log in right here. My hands trembled as I typed the password. The app loaded, then froze for a second before displaying the numbers. My heart lurched. My balance. It's off by more than $200,000. Rosa leaned in. Transfers I scrolled. 5 of them. All during the weeks I was in the hospital. Each to a new account name, Whitmore Consulting LLC. Her expression hardened. Lydia's last name. My mouth went dry. They didn't just take the house. Rosa picked up her pen, jotting notes in fast slanted handwriting. They took your entire liquidity base. That's funding for something. Probably a purchase or a down payment. Evelyn, they're using your money to build something big. I pressed my hands together, trying to breathe evenly. She always said they wanted to invest in property. Michael mentioned rezoning once, but I thought it was just talk. Rosa looked up sharply. Rezoning of what area? My street, Magnolia Gardens. She said developers were interested because it was near the new freeway expansion. Rosa's eyes narrowed. That neighborhood's gold right now. If they're buying up houses, your property could be the anchor. We're not just dealing with greed. This could be organized fraud. I stared at her. My son is part of that, I don't know yet. But I do know Lydia didn't come up with this alone. She's too smart to get her hands dirty. Rosa's phone buzzed. She answered, pacing. Yes, I need a property search on Magnolia Gardens, titles, recent transfers, and any LLCs connected to Whitmore or Carter. Priority. She hung up and turned back to me. We'll get answers today. I watched her work, feeling the room come alive with purpose. For the first time since I stood in that rain, I wasn't helpless. I had someone on my side. By mid-morning, Rosa spread her laptop on the desk, papers fanned out like a battlefield. Look at this. She rotated the screen toward me. 2 houses on your block sold in the past 3 months. The buyers Sterling Residential Holdings. I've never heard of them. It's another shell. Same address as Whitmore Consulting. Same registered agent. It's all Lydia. My pulse pounded in my ears. So they've been buying out my neighbors too. Exactly. Piece by piece. Once they control enough lots, they'll petition to rezone from residential to commercial. Property values triple and they sell to developers for millions. Your house was the keystone. The realization hit like ice water. They needed my house first. That's why they pushed me out. Rosa nodded grimly. They couldn't file rezoning papers until they held every property under the same corporate name. Yours was the last. I sank back into the chair. All that talk about helping me manage my recovery, they were just waiting for me to be too weak to fight. Rosa closed the laptop. They underestimated you. The words hung between us. I wanted to believe them. She took out her phone again and began composing an email. I'm calling in a favor with an FBI contact in financial crimes. They've been tracking real estate scams targeting seniors. This fits the pattern perfectly. I blinked. The FBI, yes. Don't panic. They won't swoop in with sirens just yet. But if we collect evidence properly, they'll open an investigation. Meanwhile, you stay quiet. Don't confront them. Let them think you're beaten. That's when they make mistakes. I nodded, still stunned. I don't even know where to start. Start by taking care of yourself. Eat something. Rest. I'll handle the legal. She gave a half smile. You're a client now, Evelyn. My most important one. By afternoon, the rain had cleared completely. Sunlight slipped through the blinds, painting stripes of gold across the dull carpet. Rosa typed steadily, phone pressed to her ear. Her confidence filled the small room with energy. At one point, she looked up. I've traced Whitmore Consulting's initial capital. It came directly from your investment account 2 days after your surgery. That was when I was still in the ICU. Yes. And guess who signed the authorization? My throat closed. Michael. She nodded softly. I'm sorry. I turned away, unable to bear the image of his signature next to mine. For years, I'd taught him integrity, how money meant responsibility, not power. I remembered him at 17, handing back a lost wallet he found on the street, proud of himself for doing the right thing. I had no idea how far he'd drifted from that boy. Rosa rose and placed a hand on my shoulder. Don't blame yourself. People change under pressure, but we'll make him face what he's done. I looked at her, and Lydia, a cold smile curved her lips. Lydia won't know what hit her. That night I followed Rosa back to her car. She had insisted on driving me to a safer hotel, one that didn't rent rooms by the hour. As we loaded my bag into the trunk, she turned to me. "You still have the deed copy at your house, right?" I shook my head. "It was in the study desk. She probably took it." "Then she's holding it as proof of transfer. That means she left a paper trail." The sun was setting sky-streaked orange and purple. I leaned on my cane, watching a bird glide low across the wet parking lot. "Robert would have said this is karma," I murmured. Rosa smiled faintly. "And karma just hired a lawyer." We drove in silence for a while. The hum of the tires was oddly comforting. I felt the ache of betrayal, but also something sharper focus. When she dropped me off at the new hotel, she turned in her seat. "Tomorrow morning we meet at the county clerk's office. I'll get the transfer papers. You bring any personal records you still have. After that, I'll contact the agent at the FBI." I exhaled slowly. It feels like a lot. It is. But remember, this isn't just about revenge. It's about getting your life back. I nodded. I just never thought I'd be fighting my own child. Rosa's expression softened. "Then don't fight him. Fight the lies around him. We'll see what truth survives." She squeezed my hand, then drove away, taillights glowing red against the darkening road. Inside the quiet hotel room, I sat by the window and looked at the street below. Cars passed, their reflections blurring in the wet asphalt. I took the keys from my pocket again and held them tight in my fist. The metal bit into my palm, cold and grounding. I whispered to the empty room. "You wanted this house, Lydia. You'll regret ever touching my keys." Then I placed them on the bedside table and turned off the light, the first spark of determination burning steady inside me. The clerk's office smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, illuminating dust like suspended time. Rosa walked ahead of me, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. She carried authority the way other people carried handbags, naturally, unapologetically. "Property records, please," she told the receptionist, flashing her bar card. The young man blinked, then hurried off to fetch a box of files. I followed her to a long wooden table near the back. My cane made a soft tapping rhythm that echoed in the quiet room. Rosa set down her briefcase and opened her laptop. "This is where we find the real story," she said. "Paper never lies, people do." I lowered myself onto the bench beside her. "Do you think Lydia's name will be on the documents?" Rosa's mouth tightened. "No, she's too careful. She'll hide behind a company, probably one with your money as its foundation." When the clerk returned with the box, Rosa thanked him and started sorting through the stack. I watched her fingers move with precision, scanning line after line. "Here," she said, finally pulling one out. "Parcel 312 MG, your property. Date of transfer June 9th. I leaned forward. "That's 2 days after my surgery." "Exactly." She pointed to the signature line. "Transferred from Evelyn Carter to Whitmore Consulting LLC. Authorization by Michael Carter, power of attorney." The words blurred for a second as my eyes filled. He didn't even wait for me to wake up. Rosa reached over, covering my hand. "We'll undo this, Evelyn. I promise. But look, there's more." She flipped to the next page. "Transfer fee waived due to familial relationship." That's how they made it look legitimate. My voice came out small. "He called me Mom even as he signed it." Rosa said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence was heavy enough to speak for both of us. By noon, we had copies of every document related to the property. Rosa filed requests for certified duplicates and scanned them into her system. "Next step," she said, snapping her laptop shut, "we trace where the money went." We left the courthouse and stepped into the sticky Charleston heat. The sky was cloudless, the air thick with magnolia and car exhaust. My body ached, but my mind was sharp. "What if they're already spending it?" I asked as we reached Rosa's car. "They are," she said. "And that's good for us. The more they touch it, the easier it is to prove intent." I climbed into the passenger seat while she made a quick call. "Yes, Agent Reynolds," she said into the phone. "It's Rosa Mitchell. I have a potential case of elder financial abuse, forged authorization, and real estate fraud across multiple properties. I'm sending over evidence this afternoon." She listened for a moment, nodded, then ended the call. "They're interested," she told me. "But they'll need hard proof of the paper trail, emails, digital signatures, communication between Michael and Lydia." I stared out the window. He barely calls me Mom anymore. But I bet he emailed me plenty when he needed my password. Rosa's brow furrowed. Did he ever ask for your online banking credentials? I thought back. Yes, just before surgery. He said it was in case the hospital needed direct deposits for insurance claims. She cursed under her breath. That's how they did it. We drove in silence for several miles. Charleston rolled by porches, old brick buildings, sun-bleached awnings. I used to love this city, its elegance and quiet dignity. Now it felt tainted, every street corner holding a memory I no longer trusted. At a red light, Rosa glanced at me. You're awfully calm. I'm past crying, I said simply. Now I'm angry. Rosa smiled faintly. Good. Anger gets things done. Back at the hotel, Rosa set up her laptop on the small round table. I sat beside her, the hum of the air conditioner mixing with the soft click of her keyboard. Agent Reynolds is looping in a forensic accountant, she said. We'll have a clearer picture by tomorrow. I folded my hands in my lap. And what do I do tonight? Rest, she said, not looking up. Eat something that isn't from a vending machine. I nodded, but rest felt impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lydia's smile, the one she wore when she told me I couldn't stay. Near dusk, Rosa's phone buzzed with a new email. She opened it, and her expression darkened. You're not going to like this. I braced myself. What now? She turned the screen toward me. Remember the Hendersons? They live across from you. Yes, they've been there forever. They sold their house last month to the same LLC, and the Millers 2 doors down did the same 3 months ago. The buyer listed is Sterling Investment Properties. I frowned. That's not Whitmore Consulting. No, but it's registered to the same mailing address in Dallas. A cold weight settled in my stomach. They're buying the whole block. Rosa nodded. Using your money to do it. My mind reeled. So it's not just theft, it's a coordinated takeover. That's why we need the FBI. They can trace shell corporations across states. Lydia and her family have done this before, I guarantee it. I looked down at my hands, the veins visible beneath my thin skin. She played the perfect daughter-in-law, baking pies, helping with bills. I thought she cared. Rosa's voice softened. Predators always start with trust. The sound of thunder rolled far away, a low, steady rumble. I turned toward the window, watching lightning flicker across the horizon. When Robert died, I told myself I'd raised Michael right, I said quietly. He used to say he'd take care of me. Now I'm a liability he sold for a profit. Rosa closed her laptop gently. You're more than what they think you are, and you're not alone anymore. I gave a small, tired smile. That's what I'm afraid of, they don't know that yet. She poured 2 small cups of coffee from the machine in the corner. The taste was bitter metallic, but it woke me up. She pulled a folder from her bag and laid out a timeline on the table. We'll hit them in 3 phases. 1, recover the financial data. 2, document property manipulation. 3, coordinate with federal investigators. I traced the lines on the page, and after that her eyes met mine. After that we take back what's yours and make sure they can't do it to anyone else. It was close to midnight when she finally left. She promised to meet me again in the morning with updates. I locked the door behind her, the room suddenly too quiet. The hum of the mini fridge was the only sound. I walked to the window. The parking lot glistened under the streetlights, reflecting the humid air. Somewhere a siren wailed in the distance. I thought about the life I had built with Robert, the garden, the dinners on the porch, the smell of freshly baked cornbread. And then I thought of Lydia's manicured hand on the door frame, blocking me out of that life. I went to the bedside table and picked up my keys again, their metal edges pressed against my skin. I turned them over one by one until I found the smallest, an old brass key with a scratch across the middle. It was the side entrance key, the one Michael used as a teenager when he snuck home past curfew. He used to think I didn't know. I smiled faintly through the ache in my chest. Maybe that lock still worked. Maybe that would be where I started. Outside, lightning cracked again, illuminating the wet streets. I whispered to the dark glass, "You took everything from me, but you forgot I built that house first." The storm rolled closer, and I didn't look away. The next morning I woke before sunrise, the air still heavy from the storm. My body protested every movement, but my mind was clear. I dressed in the same navy slacks I had worn home from the hospital and pulled my hair back into a low bun. Rosa arrived just as the sky began to brighten, carrying 2 coffees and a determination that filled the room before she even spoke. "Today we get inside," she said, handing me a cup. "We need first-hand evidence from your house." "You still have the side door key, right?" I nodded, fingers brushing the brass key in my coat pocket. "It's the only one they forgot to change. Then we move now before they wake up. Lydia has a morning routine. Gym at 9, salon at 10. Her schedule is as predictable as her perfume. She doesn't expect me to come back," I said quietly. Rosa smiled without humor. "Good. That's what makes it perfect." We drove through Charleston in silence. The streets glistened from the night's rain and the air smelled like wet pine and salt. My heart thudded beneath the seatbelt, each block taking me closer to the place that used to be mine. When we turned onto Magnolia Drive, I caught sight of the house, freshly painted shutters, new porch furniture, even the mailbox replaced. Lydia's touch was everywhere, polished and soulless. Rosa parked 2 blocks down behind a line of tall hedges. "We walk from here," she said, checking her phone. "I've got Agent Reynolds on standby. If things go south, we hit the panic app." I gripped my cane and stepped out of the car. My hip ached, but I ignored it. The world felt strangely still, the morning light pale and soft. Every step toward that house felt like walking through years of memories. Christmas mornings, Robert trimming the hedges, Michael running barefoot through the yard. We slipped through the side alley, moving quietly. The camellias I had planted decades ago were gone, replaced by sterile landscaping stones. I crouched near the old kitchen door, slipped the key into the lock, and turned. The faint click echoed like thunder in my chest. It opened. The kitchen looked both familiar and foreign. My grandmother's blue china was gone, replaced by white porcelain. The wooden table Robert built had been swapped for glass. It was immaculate, soulless. "Lydia's kind of clean." Rosa entered behind me, phone camera ready. "We record everything," she whispered. I nodded and walked toward the study. My cane tapped softly against the hardwood floor. Every photograph on the walls had been replaced, no trace of Robert or me anywhere, only Lydia and Michael smiling in professionally lit portraits like they'd always belonged here. The study door was ajar. I pushed it open. Papers littered the desk, contracts, blueprints, property maps. On top sat a folder labeled Magnolia Redevelopment Project. My stomach turned. Rosa began photographing each page, her voice low but precise. "They're using your house as headquarters. See this rezoning petition. Filed last week under Sterling Investment Holdings. The address listed your property." I scanned the document. "That means they've already submitted it." "Yes," she said, "and that means this is evidence." A voice startled us both. "Isabella," we froze. Standing in the doorway was Raymond Sterling, Lydia's father. Tall, silver-haired, expensive suit, the kind of man who smiled only when he was lying. "Well, this is a surprise," he said coolly. "Didn't expect to see you here so early." Rosa straightened, voice calm. "Mr. Sterling, we were just leaving." "Not before you tell me what you're doing in my office," he said, stepping closer. "Your office," I shot back, anger sharpening my voice. This was my husband's study. Every inch of this house was built by our hands. He gave a small, condescending smile. "Not anymore. The paperwork says otherwise." "Paperwork forged under false pretenses," Rosa cut in. "We have copies and the FBI will too." His expression twitched. "The FBI," I met his eyes. "You should start worrying, Raymond. You've picked the wrong widow to underestimate." For a moment, the room pulsed with silence. Then his mask slipped back into place. "I think you should leave now before I call security or the police." "Go ahead," Rosa said. "I'd love for them to see what's on this desk." His gaze flickered to the folder she had photographed, realizing too late what we'd found. He took a step toward her, but I moved first, planting my cane hard on the floor. "You touch her and I'll scream loud enough for every neighbor to hear. They still remember me." Raymond stopped. He smiled faintly, but his eyes were knives. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that. Shame your son doesn't share it." The words hit like a blow. "Leave Michael out of this," I said, though. My voice trembled. "He's in it whether you like it or not," Raymond replied. He knew exactly what was happening. I stared at him, unable to speak. Rosa took my arm. "We have what we need. Let's go." We backed toward the kitchen, every step feeling like retreat and defiance at once. As we reached the door, Raymond called after me. "You'll regret this, Isabella. You're too old to fight people like us." I turned, the morning light catching my face. "You're wrong, Raymond. I've been fighting people like you my whole life. You just don't recognize what that looks like in a woman my age." We left before he could answer. Rosa guided me down the side path back toward the hedges. My hands shook as I clutched my cane, adrenaline surging through the pain in my hip. When we reached the car, I finally exhaled. Rosa slid behind the wheel and called Agent Reynolds immediately. "We have physical evidence, rezoning documents, corporate transfers, multiple shell companies, and we were threatened by Sterling in the process." She listened for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, we'll deliver the files in person." When she hung up, I stared out the window, still shaking. "He said Michael knew." Rosa's tone softened. "He might have meant to rattle you, but we'll verify everything." He looked too confident to be bluffing. Rosa reached over, squeezing my hand. "Whatever the truth is, you'll face it on your terms. You're the one holding proof now." We stopped at a small diner on the way back. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, grounding me after the chaos. Rosa spread her notes across the table between us. "We'll organize everything, then deliver it to Reynolds. Once the FBI takes over, they'll subpoena bank records and communication logs. Lydia won't see it coming." I stirred sugar into my coffee, staring at the swirl. "Do you think they'll arrest her when the time comes?" "Yes. But remember, our strength is patience. Let them think you're beaten. It gives us time to build the trap." I nodded slowly. That's what Robert always said about handling deceit. Don't swing first. Let them show their hand. Rosa smiled. Smart man. We left the diner with a plan. Rosa returned to her office downtown to draft a formal statement for the FBI. I went back to the hotel, my body exhausted but my mind alive. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the marsh, I sat by the window watching the light fade. My phone buzzed a message from an unknown number. This time it wasn't Lydia. It was Michael. "Mom, I know you've been talking to Rosa. Please don't make this worse. We'll fix it if you just stay out of it." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Fix it. Those words, the same ones he used as a boy after breaking something precious. I typed back slowly. "You already broke it, Michael. I'm just collecting the pieces." Then I put the phone face down and turned off the lamp. The first part of the storm was over. The real reckoning was still ahead. The next 48 hours moved like a storm, fast, loud, unstoppable. Rosa spent most of it on calls connecting dots between banks, property registries, and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. I followed her instructions, keeping quiet, gathering anything that might prove my ownership: utility bills, old mortgage papers, the insurance policy Robert and I had signed decades ago. My hands shook as I placed each document in a folder. Every paper carried a memory, and every memory hurt. By Thursday morning, we sat in Agent Reynolds' office, a modest federal suite overlooking downtown Charleston. He was younger than I expected, mid-40s, with careful eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Carter," he said, extending a hand. "Miss Mitchell briefed me on your case. What's happening to you isn't uncommon, but your son's involvement complicates things." "I don't care how complicated it gets," I said. "They stole my home, my money, and my peace. I want it back." Reynolds nodded. "And you'll have it. But we need to proceed strategically. The Sterlings are professionals. They've done this before." Rosa slid a flash drive across his desk. "Everything we found: transfer documents, corporate filings, and video from the house this morning. Raymond Sterling was present and made verbal threats. He plugged it in, reviewing the files silently. His brow furrowed. These shell companies go beyond South Carolina. Dallas, Atlanta, Phoenix. This could be part of a multi-state network." I gripped my cane tighter. "Then make it count." Reynolds looked at me with something between respect and pity. "We'll get them, but we need you to be patient. We're coordinating surveillance. They'll believe they're untouchable until we make the arrest." Rosa smiled slightly. "You have no idea how good she is at pretending to be defeated." That earned a small chuckle from the agent. He handed me a card. "If they contact you again, forward everything here. Calls, texts, emails. Don't reply directly. As we left the building, I felt both lighter and heavier, hope and dread twisted together. Rosa walked beside me in silence until we reached the car. "You did well," she said. "Now the hard part begins. What's that, waiting for justice?" The wait didn't last long. That evening, while I was sorting through old files in my hotel room, my phone buzzed again. A new message from Michael. "Mom, please pick up. You don't understand what's happening." I ignored it. Seconds later, another text appeared. They said it was legal. I swear I didn't know what Lydia was planning. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Rosa's warning echoed in my mind, "Don't respond." But my fingers itched to type back. I wanted to demand answers, to scream at the boy I'd raised, to ask how he could stand there and watch me thrown out. Instead, I turned the phone face down again. My silence was louder than any reply. At 9 o'clock, Rosa called. "Evelyn, listen carefully. The FBI traced several wire transfers from your investment account to a Dallas-based holding company. It's tied to Lydia's father. They think he's laundering the money through fake property purchases." I exhaled sharply. "So they have proof enough to request warrants. But Reynolds wants you to act normal. They're watching Lydia's movements. If she suspects anything, she'll bury the evidence." I thought for a moment, then let her think she's won. Rosa hesitated. "You sure you can keep that act up? I've been pretending to be fine since the day Robert died. I can manage a little longer." The next morning, I put on my gray suit, simple but polished, and went to the bank, the same branch where I'd opened our first account 30 years ago. The teller, a young woman with nervous eyes, smiled politely as I approached. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter. How can I help you today? I'd like to see my account statements," I said, sliding over my ID. Her smile faltered. She typed something, frowned, then looked up. "It seems there's a note here. Your son Michael Carter is listed as primary manager on these accounts. I'll need his authorization to release full records." I felt my pulse spike. "Primary manager? That's my account." "I understand, ma'am, but the system—" I cut her off, lowering my voice. "Get your manager. Now." Within minutes, a man in a tailored suit appeared, his professional calm rehearsed to perfection. "Mrs. Carter, I'm sorry for the confusion. Your son updated the management authorization last month, but if you'd like to dispute it, we can file a formal review." Rosa's advice echoed in my mind, "Document everything." I slipped my phone from my bag, discreetly recording the conversation. "So you're saying my son changed ownership on my accounts without my presence?" The man hesitated. He presented legal power of attorney documents. "While I was hospitalized and sedated," I said evenly. "You might want to note that in your records." His confident smile cracked. "Of course, we'll make a report." I left the bank trembling, not from fear but fury. They had turned my life into paperwork, my trust into signatures. That evening, Rosa came by again. She found me sitting at the small desk, surrounded by stacks of folders. "You went to the bank," she said, reading the exhaustion on my face. I did. They confirmed he changed access. I recorded everything. Rosa smiled approvingly. "Good. That strengthens our case." I slumped back in the chair. I can't stop replaying that morning at the door. His face. The way he stood there like I was some stranger asking for charity. Rosa sat across from me, folding her hands. "You raised him, Evelyn. That's what makes this so cruel. But if he's chosen his side, you can't save him from it." A lump rose in my throat. "He used to bring me coffee every Sunday. Said he'd never let anyone hurt me. Sometimes the ones who promise to protect us become the ones we need protection from," Rosa said softly. We sat in silence for a long time, the hum of the air conditioner filling the gaps between words. Then Rosa's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and stood abruptly. That was Reynolds. "They're moving in." My heart stopped. "Now, yes. They're raiding the Sterling's offices in Dallas and Atlanta tonight. He wants us ready in case they need statements." I reached for my cane, adrenaline wiping away fatigue. "Then it's starting." "It's starting," Rosa confirmed. The hours that followed were a blur of tension and waiting. Rosa paced the room, phone glued to her ear, while I sat near the window watching the rain return. Every rumble of thunder made me flinch. I thought of Lydia's perfect smile, Raymond's smug tone, and Michael's pleading text. Somewhere out there, the life they'd built on my back was collapsing. Just after midnight, Rosa's phone rang again. She answered, listened, then exhaled. They have them. The Sterlings are in custody. I pressed a hand to my mouth. All of them, Raymond and Claudia, yes. Lydia wasn't home, but they have warrants for her arrest. A wave of disbelief and relief crashed over me. It's really happening. Rosa nodded, eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Justice takes its time, but it doesn't forget. I turned back to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. Somewhere in that dark night, my enemies were finally realizing the cost of what they'd done. And yet, under the quiet joy, another thought surfaced, a question that refused to rest. If Lydia was caught, what would happen to Michael? I didn't want the answer. Not yet. Outside, the thunder faded into distance, leaving only the soft whisper of rain. I touched the keys on the table and closed my hand around them. They'd taken my house, my money, and my son's soul, but I was still standing, and this time I wasn't walking away. The call came just after dawn. Rosa was still asleep on the couch in the corner of the hotel suite, her laptop half open beside her. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen flashing Reynolds, FBI, Mrs. Carter. His voice was calm but clipped. We've got movement. Lydia's on the run. She withdrew $30,000 in cash from a Charleston branch last night and tried to drive to Georgia. We intercepted her before she reached the state line. I sat up straight. Is she in custody now? Yes. She's being transferred for questioning as we speak. And there's more. You might want to sit down. I was already sitting, but my legs felt weak anyway. What is it? Your son was with her when she was arrested. The words fell like a hammer. Michael, yes. He claims he didn't know about the warrant, but they were traveling together. We're bringing them both in. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. Rosa stirred awake, rubbing her eyes. What's going on? She asked softly. I ended the call, my voice breaking. They caught Lydia, and Michael was with her. Rosa's expression hardened. Then it's time for him to face what he's done. The ride to the federal building felt endless. Charleston was waking up commuters, school buses, the smell of early coffee, but the city seemed muted to me, blurred behind the glass of Rosa's car. My mind kept flashing through images: Michael at 5 running barefoot through the yard, Michael at 16 grinning behind the wheel of his first car, Michael at 38 standing silent while Lydia told me to leave my own house. When we arrived, Agent Reynolds met us in the hallway outside the interview rooms. His tie was crooked, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion. She's talking, he said. Lydia's been trying to shift the blame as expected, but the evidence we've collected paints her as the ringleader. Raymond and Claudia have already started cooperating, turning on her to save themselves. And Michael, I asked. He hesitated. He's confused, angry. Claims Lydia lied to him about the paperwork and the transfers. We'll sort through what's true later. I want to see him. Rosa touched my arm. Evelyn, wait. Maybe let them question him first. But I shook my head. No. If he's going to face the truth, it'll start with me. Reynolds looked between us, then nodded. All right. Give me a minute. We waited outside as he spoke with another agent. Through the narrow window, I caught a glimpse of Lydia in one of the rooms, hair disheveled, still in last night's clothes. Even without hearing her, I could see the venom in her gestures. Her hands moved fast, defensive, blaming. 10 minutes later, Reynolds opened the door across the hall. You can come in, he said. The sight of my son broke something in me. Michael sat at a metal table, his wrists free but his posture slumped. He looked smaller somehow, the confidence stripped away. His tie hung loose, his eyes bloodshot. When he saw me, he stood. Mom. I held up a hand before he could speak. Sit down, Michael. He obeyed. I sat across from him, the cold metal chair creaking beneath me. For a moment, the silence between us said everything words couldn't. She told me you were fine, he said finally, that you agreed to move out, that it was temporary until the renovations were done. I didn't know, Mom, I swear. I stared at him. You stood there while she told me I couldn't come home. You didn't stop her. He looked down at his hands. I thought it was for your own good. She said the stairs were too dangerous for you after surgery. I thought we were doing the right thing. Rosa, standing by the door, scoffed quietly. The right thing doesn't involve power of attorney fraud. Michael's jaw tightened. I didn't know she used those documents that way. She told me it was a formality. She used my signature to drain every account I ever had, I said. That's not a formality. His voice cracked. I made mistakes, Mom. I trusted her. But I didn't plan any of this. Reynolds stepped inside. Mrs. Carter, I need to brief you on what we've found. It might clarify a few things. He laid a file on the table, opening it to reveal a series of printed transactions. During your hospitalization, 5 major transfers were made from your investment portfolio to Whitmore Consulting. We traced those funds into down payments for properties under Sterling Investment Holdings. Lydia coordinated the deals, but Michael signed off as secondary authorization. Michael buried his face in his hands. She said it was refinancing. She said you agreed. I closed my eyes. So you didn't think it was strange that your mother's money suddenly moved to her father's company? He didn't answer. Reynolds continued, flipping to another page. We also found communication between Lydia and Raymond regarding property manipulation, altered appraisals, falsified loan documents, fake inspection certificates. Your mother's financial credentials were used to legitimize every one of those deals. That's why the FBI's involved. Michael looked up at me, desperate. Mom, I didn't know. Please believe me. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But trust was a fragile thing, and mine had been shattered into dust. You let her use my name, I said softly. You let her build an empire on my life's work. And you watched me get thrown out of my own house. Tears filled his eyes. I thought she loved me, Rosa muttered. She loved your mother's bank account. Reynolds closed the file. We'll be charging Lydia with conspiracy, fraud, and elder financial abuse. As for Michael, that depends on the degree of his cooperation. I stood slowly, leaning on my cane. My heart hurt more than my hip. He'll cooperate, I said. Michael looked up, startled. Mom, you'll tell them everything, I said firmly. Every document, every meeting, every lie she told you. If there's any part of you that remembers who you used to be, prove it. He nodded weakly, tears streaking his face. Reynolds glanced at Rosa. We'll continue questioning separately. Mrs. Carter, you can wait outside. I left the room, closing the door behind me. Rosa guided me to a bench in the hallway. For a while I couldn't speak. Finally she said, you handled that better than I expected. I don't feel better, I murmured. He's still my son. Yes, she said gently. But now he knows his mother isn't the easy target he thought she was. Hours passed before the agents finished. By late afternoon, Reynolds returned. He's talking, he said. Gave us names, accounts, everything. That will help our case immensely. What happens now, I asked. We'll file formal charges. Lydia and the Sterlings will be processed tonight. Your son will likely avoid the worst penalties if his testimony holds. But it's going to get ugly before it's over. I nodded slowly. Then let it get ugly. As we left the building, the sun was setting over the Ashley River, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. Rosa drove in silence, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the folder of evidence. At a stoplight, she turned to me. You know what this means, right? You've got them cornered. I looked out the window at the fading light. I don't want them cornered. I want them accountable. When we reached the hotel, I stepped out of the car and faced the warm breeze coming off the river. It smelled like salt and rain, like something old being washed clean. Inside my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the exhaustion catch up to me. My phone buzzed again, a new message from an unknown number. It was just one sentence. You don't know what we started, Evelyn. It's bigger than you think. No signature. But I knew it was Lydia. I deleted it without replying, then opened the curtains wide. The sky outside was deep blue, the kind that promised another storm. I stared into it until the first stars appeared. Let it come, I thought. I'm ready this time. The clock on the hotel wall read 6 o'clock sharp when Rosa knocked on my door. She was dressed in black slacks and a fitted blazer, her hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun. It's time, she said, holding up a small recording device. Operation Magnolia is live. I buttoned my gray jacket with trembling hands, my heart pounding like it had the morning of my surgery. You're sure this will work? Rosa's lips curved into the faintest smile. It already has. Lydia thinks you've given up. She's expecting you to come by and sign a few papers to finalize the transfer. She has no idea the FBI's watching every move. I exhaled slowly. Then let's finish this. We drove in silence to Magnolia Drive. The morning light was soft, washing over the neighborhood I had loved for 3 decades. As we turned the corner, I saw my house, its shutters freshly painted, its porch scrubbed clean, its soul stripped bare. It didn't look like home anymore. It looked like a showroom. Rosa parked 2 blocks down out of sight. Agent Reynolds' voice came over her earpiece. Visual confirmed. Team Alpha in position. I stepped out of the car and straightened my back. "I can do this," I whispered. "You've done harder things," Rosa replied, walking beside me. We approached from the side, following the old path lined with camellia stumps. The air smelled of new paint and betrayal. Lydia was waiting in the doorway, wearing a cream-colored dress and that smug smile that had haunted my nights. "Evelyn," she said sweetly, "you came after all." I met her eyes, forcing calm. "I figured we should settle things properly." "Exactly what I was hoping for." She stepped aside. "Come in." Inside the house gleamed like a stranger's museum. My furniture was gone, replaced by modern glass and chrome. The walls bore no photographs, only sterile prints of landscapes that meant nothing. My cane tapped softly against the floor, echoing like a memory of what used to be. Lydia gestured toward the dining table, where a neat folder sat beside a pen. "These are the last documents to make everything official. Just a few signatures and we can finally move on." "Move on," I repeated, sitting down slowly. "You make it sound so clean." She laughed lightly. "It's better for everyone, Evelyn. You get peace, we get stability. The neighborhood gets progress." I looked around the room, then back at her. "And you get rich." Her smile flickered. "Progress has a price." "I've already paid mine," I said, opening the folder. The papers inside were legal-looking, but riddled with jargon: fund transfers, account authorizations, property rights. My eyes scanned until I found what I needed. "Tell me, Lydia, what's this clause here?" She leaned over the table, perfume sharp and cloying. "That just confirms your consent to move remaining assets for your health care." "It's routine." "Routine," I echoed, tapping the page. "Like draining $200,000 from my investments while I was unconscious." She froze. "Excuse me." I met her gaze squarely. "You really should have been more careful with your timing. The FBI doesn't like coincidences." Her face went pale. "What are you talking about?" From outside, Reynolds' voice came softly through Rosa's earpiece. Audio confirmed. "Keep her talking." I smiled thinly. "Oh, come now, Lydia. You're good at talking. How long have you and your father been running this little property game, buying up Magnolia Gardens under different LLCs, using my savings to fund it?" Her mouth tightened. "You don't know what you're saying." "Don't I? I've seen the documents, the wire transfers, even the rezoning applications. You used my house as headquarters, my name, to open accounts, my son to sign papers. I'd say that makes me very well informed." Lydia took a step back. "You can't prove any of that." Rosa, standing near the door, raised her phone slightly. "Actually, she can." Lydia turned on her. "You're recording this." Before Rosa could answer, another voice interrupted. "Lydia, what's going on?" Darren Sterling appeared from the hallway, his sleeves rolled up, phone in hand. "Who are you people?" "People who've had enough," I said calmly. He glanced between us, confused, angry. "This is private property. You can't just—" I cut him off. "Funny, that's what I said when you stole it." Rosa's hand brushed the phone in her pocket, sending the signal. Outside, a car door slammed, followed by another, then a third. Within seconds, the front door burst open. FBI hands where we can see them. Darren spun around, but 2 agents were already inside, their badges flashing. Lydia gasped, stumbling backward. "This is insane." "She's setting us up." I stood, leaning on my cane. "No, Lydia. You set yourself up months ago. You just didn't realize who was watching." Reynolds stepped in, his tone calm but firm. "Lydia Sterling. Darren Sterling, you're under arrest for conspiracy, financial fraud, and elder exploitation." Lydia's eyes darted to me, pure venom. "You old witch. You think this will bring your son back to you? He's as guilty as we are." I felt the words like a slap. "Maybe, but at least he's still my son. You'll be nothing but a footnote." As the agents cuffed them, Darren tried to speak. "We can make a deal. I can tell you." Reynolds shut him down. "You can tell your lawyer." Lydia struggled as they led her outside. "You'll regret this, Evelyn. You'll regret every her voice cut off as the door closed behind her. Silence filled the house. It was strange hearing nothing but the distant hum of police radios and the soft creak of the old floorboards beneath me. For the first time in months, I could breathe. Rosa placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did it." "No," I said quietly. "We did." Through the window, I saw my neighbors gathering across the street, whispering to each other. A few waved tentatively when they recognized me. I raised my cane in return, the gesture small but steady. Reynolds walked back inside, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Carter, we'll need your formal statement later today. But congratulations, you've just dismantled a multi-million-dollar fraud ring." I looked around the room, taking in the unfamiliar furniture, the smell of new paint, the ghost of everything that had once made this place home. "It's strange," I said softly. "Winning doesn't feel the way I thought it would." Rosa smiled sadly. "That's because this isn't the end. It's just the first chapter of getting your life back." As we stepped outside, the air felt lighter. The camellia bushes were gone, but a single weed had forced its way through the soil near the steps. I bent slightly, tracing its leaves with my finger. Life always finds a way back, I thought. Reynolds stopped beside me. "One more thing, Mrs. Carter. While we were searching the Sterling's files, we found additional accounts. Some are in your name, others in your son's. We'll need to investigate further." My stomach turned. "My son," he nodded. "It's possible he was more involved than he admitted." Rosa met my eyes. "We'll confirm before we assume anything." I straightened slowly. "Do what you have to do. If he's guilty, I won't protect him. But I need to know." Reynolds nodded once, then walked toward the agents loading boxes of evidence into vans. As I stood on the porch, I felt the wind shift. The house behind me was still a battlefield, but for the first time I was the one standing tall among the ruins. Rosa joined me, sliding her sunglasses on. "You ready to go?" I looked at the door one last time. "Let them keep the furniture," I said. "I'll rebuild everything else from the ground up." We walked down the path together, past the broken soil where my flowers used to grow. In the distance, thunder rumbled again, soft and low, like an echo of what had been, and a warning of what was still to come. By the next morning, the front page of the Charleston Gazette carried the headline, "Local Family Caught in $12 Million Real Estate Fraud." Beneath it, a photo of my house. My home was splashed in full color, surrounded by police tape. My name appeared only once under the caption, "Victim of Elder Financial Exploitation." But the whole town knew who I was. Calls flooded in all day. Old friends, former neighbors, even church acquaintances who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly wanted to express outrage or sympathy. I turned off my phone after lunch. I didn't need their pity. What I needed was truth, especially about Michael. Rosa arrived shortly after 3, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a brown envelope. She looked tired, but satisfied, her sharp eyes still burning with purpose. "They're charging Lydia and her parents formally tomorrow," she said, setting the envelope on the table. "But that's not why I'm here." I stared at the envelope. "Then what is this evidence?" she said quietly. "Reynolds sent it over this morning. He wanted me to review it before showing you. It's about Michael." My throat tightened. "What did they find?" Rosa hesitated, her fingers tapping the envelope's corner. "Let's go through it together." Inside were printed emails and bank statements. The paper smelled faintly of toner and something sterile like a courtroom. She spread them across the table. Each page told a story one I'd prayed wasn't true. The first email was dated 6 months before my surgery. Subject line, "Investment Opportunity, Magnolia Redevelopment." It was from Raymond Sterling to Michael Carter. "We believe your mother's property can serve as the foundation for a new project. If you can convince her to sign temporary transfer paperwork, we'll ensure both you and Lydia benefit substantially once the zoning is approved." Beneath it, Michael's reply, "I'll handle it. She trusts me." The room went still. I could hear only the hum of the air conditioner, faint and constant. "He was involved before my surgery," I whispered. Rosa's voice was steady but soft. "He might have thought it was legitimate at first, but these later messages..." She flipped to another page. "This one, 2 weeks before I was hospitalized. She's getting nervous about the forms. Maybe after the operation will be easier. She won't ask questions then." My hands trembled. "He waited until I was weak." "I think he thought he'd control it before it got out of hand," Rosa said carefully. But by the time the transfers started, Lydia and her parents were running everything. I shook my head, fighting tears. That doesn't excuse it. He planned the timing. He made me sign those papers when I could barely sit up. Rosa didn't argue. She reached across the table, resting a hand over mine. You don't have to forgive him, Evelyn, but you deserve to know the truth. I stared at the documents again, each line cut deeper. My son, the boy I'd held through fevers and heartbreaks, had traded my trust for profit. Then Rosa opened the final sheet. There's one more thing, she said. The nurse from the hospital, her name's Miranda Jenkins. She confessed to manipulating your medication after being paid by the Sterlings. I froze. Paid to keep me there longer, Rosa nodded. They wanted you incapacitated long enough to complete the transfers. The payments came from a Sterling shell company, but Michael authorized them. Reynolds confirmed the signature. The world tilted. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. He tried to kill me. No, Rosa said quickly. It wasn't an intentional attempt on your life. They told the nurse to make sure your recovery took weeks, not days. But yes, it was deliberate harm. I pressed a hand to my chest. That's worse. He didn't even want me dead, just weak enough not to fight. We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of betrayal pressing down like a physical force. Outside, the late afternoon sun poured through the curtains, too bright for such darkness. Finally, I asked, Does Reynolds know I've seen these? Rosa nodded. He wanted you to decide how to handle it. Michael's cooperation could reduce his sentence, but the charges are serious fraud, abuse of power of attorney, and complicity in elder exploitation. He could face up to 10 years. 10 years, I repeated. The words tasted like ash. He'll be middle-aged when he gets out. Maybe that's fitting. Rosa leaned back, exhaling slowly. Do you want to see him again? Reynolds said he's been asking to talk. I looked at the window, at the sliver of sky turning orange over the rooftops. Not yet. If I see him now, I'll only see what he did not, who he was. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window of the hotel suite, watching the city lights flicker across the water. The papers lay open on the table beside me, their edges curling slightly. Each page was proof not only of deceit, but of my own blindness. I remembered the day Michael brought Lydia home for the first time. She had that polished charm, the kind that masks calculation. Robert had disliked her instantly, though he never said so outright. That girl looks at money like a wolf looks at a sheep, he'd muttered once after she'd excused herself from dinner to take a work call. He'd been right. And I, too eager to see my son happy, had ignored every warning. At 2 a.m, a knock startled me. I opened the door to find Rosa still fully dressed, a folder under her arm. I couldn't sleep either, she said. Reynolds just called. There's been a development. My heart skipped. What now? The FBI recovered files from Raymond's Dallas office. They found photos from your hospital stay taken inside the ICU. I felt the blood drain from my face. How is that possible? They think someone at the hospital gave them access. The same nurse, probably. She's under federal protection now and naming names. There's also an insurance policy on your life. Taken out 6 months ago. The beneficiary was Michael. For a moment, everything inside me went cold. My son insured my death. Rosa's voice softened. We don't know if he understood what he was signing. Lydia could have handled it, used his signature to make it look legitimate. But it was in his name. I walked to the mirror, barely recognizing the woman reflected there. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, but her posture, her spine was straight. They tried to erase me, I said quietly. First from my house, then from my own life. But I'm still here. Rosa's voice was low but firm. And you're stronger than they ever imagined. The following day we met with Reynolds again. The federal office buzzed with activity agents, carrying files, phones ringing, printers whirring. He ushered us into a small conference room. Mrs. Carter, he began, I need you to prepare yourself. What we've uncovered changes everything about the scope of this case. He handed me a report. At the top in bold were the words Federal Investigation, Sterling Investment Network, Multi-State Fraud, and Elder Targeting Operation. 17 properties, 14 victims, 2 confirmed deaths linked to manipulated hospitalizations. I looked up at him, horrified. You mean this wasn't just about me? No, Reynolds said grimly. You were their biggest target, but not their first. I gripped the edge of the table. Then we finish it, I said. Every one of them. Every company, every account, every person who helped them. Rosa nodded in agreement. They thought they were using an old woman's weakness. Let's make them choke on it. For the first time in months, I felt something sharp return to my chest. Not grief, not despair, but a quiet, steady fire. They had taken nearly everything, but they hadn't taken my will. As we left the office, the spring air smelled like rain and salt. Across the parking lot, the sky stretched wide, streaked with violet clouds. For the first time in a long while, I felt like the wind was at my back. They thought they'd buried me, I murmured, gripping my cane. They just didn't realize I was the one holding the shovel. I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the hotel window, soft and steady like a heartbeat that wouldn't let me forget I was still alive. Rosa was already gone. She'd left a note on the counter, meeting with Reynolds at 9. Rest. We'll call you when it's time. But resting was impossible. The revelations from the night before looped through my mind. The manipulated hospital records, the life insurance policy, the idea that my own son might have been part of something that could have ended my life. By 8, I couldn't sit still any longer. I showered, dressed, and made myself a cup of coffee that went untouched as I stared at the city skyline through the rain-streaked glass. My phone buzzed a message from Reynolds. We've confirmed more. I'd like you to come in today. It's better if you hear it from us directly. I read it twice, then grabbed my umbrella and my cane. The streets of Charleston shimmered with puddles as I walked to the waiting cab. I felt strange, both fragile and unstoppable, like glass forged in fire. When I reached the federal office, Rosa was waiting in the lobby, her face drawn tight. They've got something, she said softly as she led me toward a conference room. And it's bad. Inside, Reynolds stood near the projector, arms folded. His expression was grave, the kind reserved for people who've seen too much. Mrs. Carter, he began, thank you for coming. We've analyzed new data from the Sterling servers seized last week. There's something you need to see. He clicked a button and the projector flickered to life. A series of emails appeared on the screen between Lydia Raymond and someone labeled simply MC. Those are Michael's initials, I whispered. Yes, Reynolds said. But let's go through them one by one. The first message was dated a week before my surgery. Lydia, she's signing the power of attorney today. Once it's done, we'll have full access. Keep her calm, Michael. This has to look voluntary. Then his reply, understood. She trusts me completely. I'll bring the forms to the hospital myself. I felt the air leave my lungs. My son's words, cold, procedural, almost businesslike. He wasn't confused or manipulated. He was coordinating it. The next email was worse. Raymond, ensure the doctor doesn't discharge her early. We need more time to complete the zoning filings. Michael, leave that to Lydia. She's handling the nurse. I'll make sure Mom doesn't suspect anything. She's too weak to read through the paperwork anyway. I pressed a hand to my chest. The world tilted, blurred. Stop, I said hoarsely. Please just stop. Reynolds hesitated, then turned off the projector. The screen went dark, leaving only the faint hum of the lights above us. He did this, I whispered. All of it. Rosa reached for my hand. Evelyn, we don't know everything yet. It's possible some of those emails were altered or written under pressure. I shook my head. That's his tone, Rosa. That's my son. Reynolds cleared his throat. The evidence is strong, Mrs. Carter. But we'll still verify metadata before proceeding with charges. If he cooperates fully, he might still avoid prison time depending on what he knew about the medical manipulation. The nurse, I said quietly. Miranda Jenkins. She said Lydia arranged the payments. Did Michael's name appear there too? Reynolds nodded. Yes. He approved the transfer of funds from your joint investment account to the shell company that paid Jenkins. Without that authorization, the nurse wouldn't have received payment. It felt like a knife twisting deeper. I looked at Rosa. I need to see him. She hesitated. Evelyn, I need to look him in the eye, I said. I need to know if there's anything human left in him. By afternoon, Reynolds arranged it. The meeting was held in a small interrogation room at the detention facility. The walls were blank, the light overhead too bright. Michael sat on one side of the table, his wrists free this time, but his posture slumped. He looked older, thinner, hollow-eyed, with a week's worth of stubble and the pale complexion of a man who hadn't slept. When he saw me, he stood. "Mom, sit," I said, my voice flat. He obeyed, eyes fixed on the table. I stayed standing, my cane steady in my grip. "I've seen the emails." His head snapped up, panic flashing across his face. "They took them out of context. I was trying to—" "Don't lie to me." My voice cracked like thunder in the small room. "You told them I wouldn't question anything. You said I was too weak. You signed payments to a nurse who poisoned me with bacteria just to buy time for your wife's scam." He flinched, guilt flashing in his eyes. "I didn't know that's what they were doing. I swear, Mom. I thought it was just a way to extend the hospital stay, so the insurance would cover more time. Lydia said it would protect you." I slammed my hand on the table, the sound echoing. "Protect me. You let them use my name, my money, my house, and now my health. You let them turn me into a target." Tears filled his eyes. "I was trying to fix everything. I owed Raymond money. I thought if the project went through, we could pay him back and start over. Lydia said it was temporary." "She said," I repeated bitterly. "You always let her speak for you." He bowed his head, silent. The only sound was the steady tick of the wall clock. After a long pause, I asked the question that had haunted me since the beginning. "When she told you I couldn't come home, why didn't you stop her?" His shoulders trembled. "Because I was ashamed. I'd already ruined everything and I didn't know how to face you. When she told you to leave, He stopped, choking on the words. "I thought maybe you'd be better off without me." The cruelty of that broke something inside me, not because he was right, but because he actually believed it. I sank slowly into the chair opposite him, exhaustion settling deep in my bones. "You're my son, Michael. You were supposed to protect me. You were supposed to carry on what your father built, not destroy it." "I know," he whispered. "I wish I could undo it. You can't." I leaned forward, my voice quiet but razor sharp. "But you can tell the truth. Every detail. Every transfer. Every person involved. You owe me that." He nodded weakly. "I already did. Reynolds has my full statement. I studied him for a long time." There was remorse in his eyes, real, raw, but remorse doesn't erase consequences. It only reveals them. When I stood to leave, he reached across the table. "Mom, please. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need you to know I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was saving us." I pulled my hand back. "You didn't save anyone, Michael, but maybe you can still save what's left of your soul." As the guards escorted me out, I heard him call my name, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." I didn't look back. Outside, the sky had cleared, but the air still smelled like rain. Rosa waited by the car, watching my face carefully. "How did it go?" I stared straight ahead. He confessed enough. She didn't press further. We drove in silence through the damp streets, the world glistening under puddled sunlight. When we reached the hotel, I turned to her. "Rosa, when all this is over, when the trial's finished, promise me one thing. Anything," she said. "Help me make sure this never happens to another woman like me." Her smile was sad but resolute. "You're already doing that, Evelyn, just by surviving." That night I opened my window and let the cool breeze wash over me. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, a faint hollow echo. It no longer sounded like danger. It sounded like closure, coming closer, one storm at a time. 2 weeks later, the courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and nerves. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Rosa, my cane resting against my leg, my hands clasped tightly on my lap to keep them from shaking. The ceiling fans turned lazily above us, circulating air thick with tension. Lydia sat across the room in a tailored beige suit, her wrists unbound, her expression calm but brittle. Her parents were behind her, their lawyers whispering rapidly. Michael sat separately, his head bowed, avoiding my eyes. The clerk called the session to order. Judge Whitmore entered, her robe flowing, her expression unreadable. "The United States versus Lydia Sterling and Associates," she said clearly. "Charges include conspiracy to commit financial fraud, elder exploitation, and medical manipulation." Her eyes swept the room before settling briefly on me. "This court acknowledges the cooperation of the victim, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, whose testimony and documentation were instrumental in this investigation." The words landed softly, but their weight pressed on me like years. I hadn't wanted acknowledgement. I wanted accountability. Lydia's attorney rose first, all smooth confidence. Your Honor, my client has cooperated fully and maintains that her actions were based on miscommunication and mismanagement, not malice. She was unaware of any medical interference or illegal manipulation of bank accounts. She believed Mrs. Carter had willingly delegated authority to her son. Rosa muttered under her breath, "He's going to twist every knife he can." Then it was Reynolds's turn. He stood steady as a stone. "Your Honor, the evidence will show otherwise. We have documented proof of deliberate deceit, signed emails, bank transfers, hospital surveillance footage, and testimony from the nurse Miranda Jenkins confirming direct orders from the defendants to prolong Mrs. Carter's recovery through tampered medication." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Lydia's composure faltered for the first time. Reynolds continued. Additionally, the FBI traced shell companies used to launder funds stolen from Mrs. Carter's investment accounts totaling nearly $300,000. The defendants attempted to conceal these funds through fraudulent property acquisitions under Sterling Investment Holdings. The judge nodded slowly. "Proceed with witness statements." Rosa squeezed my hand. "You ready?" "As I'll ever be," I said, rising. The bailiff swore me in, and I took my seat on the witness stand. My reflection glinted faintly off the glass of the court reporter's machine. My voice trembled only once when I began. "I trusted them," I said simply. "I trusted my son and through him his wife. I signed papers I didn't understand because I believed I was signing for medical care. Instead, I signed away my home, my savings, my independence." Lydia watched me with icy detachment, her chin lifted. "I came back from the hospital," I continued, "and they told me I no longer had a place there." My own son stood behind her and said nothing. "They used my recovery as a window of opportunity to take everything my husband and I worked for over 30 years to build." The prosecutor nodded. "And what happened after that, Mrs. Carter?" "I found out they'd moved money from my accounts to theirs. They'd used my name and credentials to buy properties, falsify reports, and exploit my neighbors' other elderly homeowners. They didn't just take my house. They tried to erase me." Lydia's attorney objected. "Speculation and emotional language." The judge shook her head. "Overruled." "Continue, Mrs. Carter." I drew a deep breath. "When I discovered what they'd done, I contacted my lawyer, Miss Rosa Mitchell, and together we worked with the FBI. The evidence we found was enough to expose their operation." Reynolds displayed a photograph of one of the property deeds, my forged signature clear under the faint watermark of the hospital's date stamp. "Is this your signature?" "It is," I said, "but I never signed it willingly. I was sedated at that time." The judge leaned forward. "So you're saying your consent was forged under medical incapacity?" "Yes," I replied, meeting her gaze. "They planned my weakness." A hush fell. Even Lydia's lawyer stopped writing. After 2 hours, my testimony ended. I stepped down, drained but unbroken. Rosa guided me back to my seat. The prosecution called more witnesses: Reynolds, the nurse Jenkins, a financial analyst tracing the money flow. Each word, each exhibit built a wall of evidence that grew higher around Lydia and her family. When it was Michael's turn, the courtroom held its breath. He walked to the stand slowly, his cuffs removed, but his shoulders heavy with shame. He didn't look at me, not at first. The prosecutor began. "Mr. Carter, please describe your role in this operation." His voice cracked. "I was complicit. I let it happen. You knowingly allowed your mother's assets to be transferred under false pretenses." "Yes, I thought it was temporary. I thought Lydia would return everything once the investment was secured." "Did you authorize the payments to Nurse Jenkins?" "Yes. Lydia told me it was for home care preparation. I didn't know she was paying her to delay my mother's recovery." "And when your mother returned home from the hospital," he swallowed hard, "I told her she couldn't stay. I thought if she found out the truth, everything would fall apart." The prosecutor stepped aside. No further questions. Then his defense attorney stood. "Mr. Carter, have you cooperated fully with this investigation?" "Yes." "Do you take full responsibility for your actions?" "I do." "And do you understand the impact your decisions had on your mother?" At that, he looked at me for the first time. His voice broke. "I do now. I destroyed her trust. I broke something that can't be fixed." Tears welled in my eyes unbidden. I didn't want to cry in front of them, but grief doesn't obey pride. When the day ended, the judge adjourned until the following week for sentencing. Lydia's attorney tried to corner me outside the courtroom, muttering about misunderstandings and emotional manipulation, but Rosa blocked him with a glare sharp enough to cut glass. Outside, the Charleston sky was a bruised gray, the clouds heavy with rain. Rosa helped me down the courthouse steps. "You were magnificent," she said quietly. "I was just honest," I replied. "That's all I ever had left." She smiled. "Sometimes that's enough to win." That evening, I returned to the hotel, but I didn't turn on the lights. I sat by the window watching the first drops of rain hit the glass. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something unfamiliar, creeping in, not joy, not triumph, but release. The next morning, Reynolds called. "Miss Carter, I thought you'd like to know the Sterlings accepted a plea deal overnight. 20 years for Raymond, 15 for Claudia, 18 for Lydia. They won't appeal." I closed my eyes, the breath leaving me slowly. "And my son, he's still negotiating. Given his cooperation, we expect 5 years, possibly 3 with good behavior." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "Thank you, Agent Reynolds, for everything." After the call, I stepped onto the hotel balcony. The air smelled like salt and magnolia blooms. Down below, the city carried on cars, laughter, life returning to its rhythm. I realized then that justice didn't bring peace automatically. It simply cleared the way for it. The rebuilding had to come from me. That night I packed my suitcase. Tomorrow I would go home, not to a hotel, not to borrowed walls, but to the house that had been mine from the beginning. The rain stopped just before midnight, leaving the world clean and trembling with light. I whispered to the empty room, to Robert's memory, to the version of myself I'd almost lost. "They tried to erase me," I said softly, "but I'm still here, and I'm not done yet." The key trembled in my hand as I stood before the front door. The house loomed in the soft morning light, quiet, now stripped of police tape and yellow markers. Magnolia blossoms littered the walkway, their scent mingling with the faint trace of paint and cleaning solution. Rosa stood beside me, watching silently, her briefcase hanging from one hand. "Go on," she said softly. "It's yours again." The lock clicked and I stepped inside. The air smelled different, new paint, fresh wood polish, but beneath it lingered something older, the faint warmth of memory. The floors gleamed, the walls were bare, and the furniture was minimal, just what the restoration team had brought back after the FBI finished. For a long moment I didn't move. My heart ached like an old wound reopening. "This place was their headquarters," I whispered. "They plotted everything right here in this living room." Rosa placed her hand on my shoulder. "And now it's where their downfall began." "You took it back." I nodded, stepping further inside. My cane tapped lightly on the oak floor. The sound echoed through the hollow rooms, no longer filled with voices that didn't belong. In the study, the antique desk had been restored to its rightful place by the window, the way Robert liked it, facing the garden. I ran my fingers along the surface, tracing invisible lines where his notebooks once lay. Outside, the hydrangeas looked wilted and untended, but they were still alive. So was I. "I'll stay here tonight," I said quietly. Rosa frowned. "Evelyn, are you sure you've only just gotten it back? Maybe give yourself a few days before." "No," I interrupted. "I've been displaced long enough. If I can't sleep under my own roof, then they've still won." She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll have a security team stop by tonight, and I'll stay until sunset, make sure everything's working." We spent the afternoon checking through each room. The restoration team had done a meticulous job, repaired walls, polished fixtures, even replaced the windows Lydia had changed. My grandmother's china cabinet was back in its corner, the dishes intact. Somehow Rosa had tracked down my missing jewelry through evidence recovery. Each piece sat neatly inside a velvet-lined drawer. When I opened the small box containing my wedding ring, my breath caught. "Robert's ring," I said, softly lifting it into the light. "They took this from my bedside table." Rosa smiled faintly. "Now it's home again." I slipped it onto my finger where it belonged. For the first time in months, I felt whole. We shared tea in the kitchen before she left. The golden light of late afternoon streamed through the windows, casting warm patterns on the floor. "What will you do now?" she asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think it starts here. Rebuilding the garden, repainting the walls." making this house mine again in every sense. And Michael the First hesitated. He's still in custody waiting for sentencing. Reynolds said they'll likely move him to a minimum security facility in Georgia next month. He's written letters, but I haven't read them yet. Rosa nodded gently. You'll know when you're ready. After she left, silence settled like a blanket. I walked through each room, touching the walls, the frames, the restored furniture. Every mark told a story, some of pain, some of survival. In the corner of the living room, I noticed something. The workers had missed a tiny patch of old wallpaper hidden behind a bookshelf. The pattern was floral, faded, the same Robert and I had chosen when we first moved in. I smiled. Some things, even buried under years of change, refused to disappear. As evening fell, I opened the back doors and stepped onto the porch. The air was warm, filled with the hum of crickets. My garden, though neglected, still breathed. The hydrangeas drooped, the roses had withered, but the soil smelled rich, alive. I sank to my knees slowly, painfully, and began clearing the dry leaves. My hands were unsteady, but the motion was grounding, familiar. Let's start again, I whispered. I didn't hear the car until it was almost at the curb. The crunch of tires on gravel made me freeze. When I turned, I saw headlights dim and a familiar figure step out. Michael. He stood by the gate, hesitant, holding a manila envelope. They said I could see you before they transfer me, he said quietly. Just for a few minutes. I straightened slowly, gripping my cane for balance. You shouldn't be here. I know, he said, voice breaking, but I had to come. He walked closer, stopping a few feet away. He looked thinner, his once smooth face now worn with guilt. I've been writing every day, he said. Letters I never sent. I didn't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. What I did, what I let them do. I studied him in silence, unsure what I felt: anger, sorrow, love. Maybe all at once. Understanding doesn't change what happened, I said softly. He nodded. I know, but maybe it's the first step towards something better. The prosecutors said I might be released early if I keep cooperating. I'll use that time to make things right, whatever that means. He held out the envelope. This is for you. It's Dad's old letter. I found it when they went through the recovered files. He wrote it before he died, but it was sealed in one of the trust boxes Lydia tried to steal. I hesitated, then took it. Thank you. I don't deserve your thanks, he said. No, I replied, meeting his eyes, but maybe one day you'll deserve peace. He looked down, tears glinting in the fading light. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to... The sound of a car engine down the street signaled that his escort had returned. He turned toward it but paused at the gate. Mom, he said, voice trembling. When I get out, if you'll let me, I'd like to help fix the garden. I swallowed hard. We'll see. He nodded, and for the first time he didn't ask for more. When he left, the silence returned, heavier but cleaner somehow. I stood on the porch until darkness fell, the night air cool against my skin. The moonlight spilled across the garden, silvering the leaves and empty flower beds. Inside, I sat at Robert's desk and opened the envelope. His handwriting, steady, elegant, filled the page. My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. You've always been stronger than you know, but I worry that in trying to protect everyone, you'll forget to protect yourself. Promise me that when the world tries to take from you, you'll fight not just to survive, but to live fully again. Remember, this forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing peace over pain. And home isn't the walls we build, it's the strength we carry when they fall. All my love, always, Robert. I pressed the letter to my chest, my tears falling silently onto the paper. Outside, a soft breeze rustled through the hydrangeas like a whisper of his voice. I stayed there until the moon rose high, feeling the house breathe around me, alive again, mine again. When I finally went to bed, I didn't lock the door. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't afraid. I dreamed of Robert tending the garden, of Michael as a boy laughing among the roses, of myself standing in sunlight whole. And when morning came, I woke to birdsong and the smell of rain-soaked earth. The first day of my new life had begun quietly, honestly, without fanfare. But it was mine. 6 months later, the garden was alive again. The hydrangeas bloomed in thick blue clusters. The roses climbed the trellis like they were trying to touch the sky, and the air carried the scent of magnolia after rain. I stood barefoot on the porch with a cup of tea, feeling the warmth of the wood beneath my feet. For the first time in years, I didn't wake to dread or uncertainty. The house was mine again, quiet, steady, whole. Inside, sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, glinting off the framed certificate hanging near the door. The Evelyn Carter Foundation for Elder Protection and Financial Justice. The first check had come 2 weeks ago, a grant to help an elderly widow recover her stolen savings. Rosa insisted we name the foundation after me. I told her it felt strange, but she'd smiled and said, "It's not about your name, Evelyn. It's about your story." And maybe she was right. Rosa arrived that morning just after 9, her usual punctual self-carrying files and 2 coffees. "You're already outside," she called. "Habit," I said, smiling. "Old women in morning light, we get along." She joined me on the porch, handing me a cup. "The press wants another interview about the foundation's success. You've already inspired 3 states to expand elder protection units. You're becoming a legend." "I'm just a woman who got tired of being quiet," I replied. "But I'll do it. If telling my story helps someone else fight back, then it's worth it." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching a robin peck at the garden soil. The neighborhood was changing again, but this time it was genuine neighbors planting, painting, rebuilding. No predatory developers, no hidden agendas. Across the street, my neighbor Eleanor waved from her porch. She'd moved in shortly after the court case, a retired literature professor with a quick wit and a soft heart. She had sent flowers on my birthday, always remembering the date without asking. We'd grown close, 2 women who understood what it meant to lose and rebuild. "Eleanor's hosting the community fundraiser next week," Rosa reminded me. "You're still speaking." "I am. Though I don't know if people want to hear another story about betrayal and revenge." "Then tell them one about survival," she said. "About strength." I nodded. "That I can do." We went inside and she began reviewing documents at the kitchen table while I arranged fresh lilies in a vase. It felt ordinary, peaceful, 2 women working towards something that mattered. When she left later that afternoon, the house felt quiet again, but not empty. I moved through each room, checking the locks, adjusting the curtains, running my hand over the furniture that had once been stripped away. Everything had a story now, even the cracks in the walls. In the study, I sat at Robert's desk, the one that faced the garden. His letter still rested in the drawer, worn from how many times I'd unfolded it. Next to it was a new one, Michael's. He'd written from the minimum security facility in Georgia, where he was serving his reduced sentence. His words were humble, free of excuses. "Mom, they let me work in the garden here. Funny, isn't it? Soil doesn't care who you were before, it only responds to care. I'm learning that lesson the hard way." He wrote about classes, about therapy, about how he was helping teach younger inmates to read. "I don't ask you to forgive me," he'd ended, "but if you ever plant again, think of me when you see the first sprout. Maybe something good can grow from me after all." I folded the letter and placed it beside Robert's. My 2 men, one gone, one trying to come back to life in his own way. That evening, Eleanor stopped by with lemon bars and news. "Did you hear?" she said, setting the tray down. "Lydia finally gave her first prison interview. Claims she was a victim of circumstance." I laughed softly. "Some people never learn that the truth isn't negotiable. She also said you ruined her life." "Good," I said, sipping my tea. "Then maybe she'll spend the next 15 years thinking about how she tried to ruin mine." Eleanor chuckled, then grew quiet. "You know, I've seen a lot of people break under less. But you rebuilt yourself from ashes." "I had help," I said. "Rosa Reynolds, even Michael in his way. Pain teaches differently when it comes from blood. It carves deep, but it makes room for something new." We sat on the porch until twilight, watching the sky turn violet over the neighborhood. The lights in the houses flicked on one by one, and laughter drifted faintly from somewhere down the street. Life had returned, not perfect, not simple, but real. When Eleanor left, I walked back inside and turned on the soft lamp near Robert's desk. My foundation's new website was open on the computer, photos of families reunited, seniors holding recovered deeds, smiling faces that reminded me why I kept fighting. The caption at the top read, "Justice grows where courage is planted." I smiled, tracing the words with my finger. Before bed, I walked out to the garden again. The moon was high, silvering the hydrangeas. I knelt beside the soil, where the first new rosebush had taken root. It had bloomed earlier than expected, pale pink and trembling in the wind. I whispered to it as if speaking to Robert and Michael both. "See, things can grow again." A soft breeze stirred the leaves in response. Inside, I poured myself a final cup of tea and sat by the window, the same one where I'd once watched the FBI cars roll up, terrified and heartbroken. Now, the only light outside came from the lamppost, reflecting off the quiet street. I thought about how far I'd come from that moment of betrayal at the door, standing with my hospital bag while my own son told me I couldn't stay to this one steady, strong hole. I hadn't just reclaimed my house. I'd reclaimed my dignity. My purpose. The clock ticked softly in the background. I wrote one final note for myself in the journal I kept by the window. They stole my peace for a while, but not my soul. They mistook silence for weakness. They forgot that when women like me fall, we don't stay down, we rebuild. The night deepened, wrapping the house in stillness. I felt Robert's presence, faint but warm, and for the first time I didn't ache. I just breathed. As I turned out the light, I whispered the same words he'd written to me in that letter months ago. Home isn't the walls we build, it's the strength we carry when they fall. Outside, the wind rustled the hydrangeas, and the stars blinked faintly over Charleston. I smiled into the darkness, feeling the quiet kind of peace that doesn't need witnesses. And as I drifted to sleep, I knew this wasn't just the end of my story, it was the beginning of a new one. If you've stayed with me through this journey, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and whether you believe that justice, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way home. And if you do, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next story I tell might just remind you that strength has no age limit and karma never forgets its address.